September 22, 1945, 12:47 p.m., a press conference room in Bavaria, Germany. The war in Europe has been over for 4 months. The cameras are rolling. General George S. Patton, Jr., the man who drove armored columns across France, who broke the Bulge, who terrified German commanders more than any other Allied general, sits before a wall of microphones. A reporter asks him about denazification, about why former Nazi officials still hold administrative posts in the American occupation zone. Patton leans forward. What he says next will nearly end his career. Not on a battlefield, not in the heat of combat, but in a room full of journalists with his own words as the weapon turned against him. This is the story of how one of America's greatest battlefield commanders came within days of being relieved, not for slapping soldiers, not for disobeying orders in combat, but for speaking his mind when the microphones were on and the political winds had shifted. 4 months earlier, the champagne had flowed freely. VE Day, victory in Europe. Patton's Third Army had carved a path of devastation through the heart of the Third Reich, covering more ground, capturing more territory, and inflicting more casualties than any other Allied army. His troops had liberated concentration camps, crossed the Rhine, driven deep into Czechoslovakia. Patton himself had become a household name, a symbol of American fighting spirit, aggressive to the point of recklessness, brilliant to the point of arrogance. But wars don't end cleanly. By September 1945, Patton commands the 15th Army, essentially a paper-pushing headquarters tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign. It's a demotion dressed up as an honor. The real power in occupied Germany belongs to his replacement as Third Army commander. Patton, the warrior, has been sidelined in peacetime. And he's furious about what he sees. Bavaria is crawling with former Nazi Party members. They're in the postal service, the railways, the municipal governments. Some had been low-level functionaries. Others had been more deeply involved. The official American policy is denazification. Root out Nazi influence, prosecute war criminals, rebuild Germany as a democracy. It sounds noble on paper. Patton thinks it's madness. He watches the occupation machinery grind to a halt because the Americans have fired every German administrator with even a tenuous party affiliation. The phones don't work. The trains don't run on time. The infrastructure is collapsing. And all the while, he's watching another enemy rise in the East. The Soviets. Patton has despised them since the moment he met them on the Elbe. He's watched them strip entire factories from Eastern Germany, ship them back to Russia. He's heard reports of mass arrests, disappearances, brutal reprisals. To Patton, the Cold War isn't coming, it's already here. And the Americans, in his view, are dismantling the one nation that could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. He said as much, privately to his staff, to his diary. But on September 22nd, he says it publicly. The press conference is supposed to be routine, an update on occupation administration. But the questions turn pointed. Why are Nazis still in positions of authority? Isn't this a betrayal of what we fought for? Patton's jaw tightens. He looks at the reporters, at the microphones, and he decides to tell them exactly what he thinks. The Nazi thing, Patton says, his voice edged with irritation, is just like a Democratic and Republican election fight. Silence. He keeps going. He argues that many Germans joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological fervor, but out of necessity, to keep their jobs, to avoid suspicion, to survive. In Patton's view, forcing them all out of work is impractical and counterproductive. He compares it to American politics, as if membership in a fascist regime that committed genocide is no different than choosing a political party in a democracy. The reporters scribble furiously. One presses further. Is the general saying that former Nazis should be allowed to hold office? Patton doubles down. He says that in many cases, they're the only ones with the technical knowledge to keep society functioning. He talks about plumbers, engineers, clerks, people whose expertise is needed, party membership or not. What he doesn't say, what the reporters hear anyway, is that he doesn't particularly care about denazification, that he sees it as a distraction, that he views the Soviets as the real enemy and thinks the Americans should be rearming Germany, not dismantling it. The microphones capture every word. Within hours, the story is racing across wire services. Patton defends Nazis. The headlines are brutal, reductive, and not entirely inaccurate. Back in the United States, a country still processing the horrors of the Holocaust, still mourning its war dead, the reaction is immediate and volcanic. Congressmen demand his removal. Veterans groups issue statements of condemnation. Eisenhower, now the military governor of occupied Germany and Patton's direct superior, reads the reports with his head in his hands. He's protected Patton before, after the slapping incidents in Sicily, after Patton's reckless statements about post-war Soviet intentions. Eisenhower has absorbed the political heat because Patton was indispensable on the battlefield. But there are no more battlefields. And this time, Patton has handed his enemies a loaded gun. Eisenhower knows what has to happen. He's known Patton for decades, fought alongside him, covered for him, admired his battlefield genius even while wincing at his political naivety. But this isn't 1944. The war is over. The cameras are always on. And Patton has just committed political suicide on live record. Eisenhower picks up the phone. September 28, 1945. Eisenhower's headquarters, Frankfurt. Patton arrives knowing what's coming. The drive from Bavaria has given him time to think, to rehearse his defense, to marshal his arguments. But as he walks into Eisenhower's office, he sees the look on his old friend's face, exhaustion mixed with something harder, disappointment. Eisenhower doesn't waste time on pleasantries. He places the newspaper clippings on the desk between them. The headlines stare up like accusers. He asks Patton if he understands the magnitude of what he's done, if he grasps the political firestorm he's ignited, if he realizes that Eisenhower's own position is now under scrutiny because he's kept Patton in command this long. Patton tries to defend himself. He argues that his words were taken out of context, twisted by reporters looking for a scandal. He insists that his point was practical, not ideological, that the occupation is failing because of bureaucratic rigidity, not because of any sympathy for Nazism. He says he was talking about low-level functionaries, not war criminals. Eisenhower listens, then he cuts him off. "George," he says, his voice quiet but firm, "I don't care what you meant. I care what you said, and what you said is indefensible." The room goes silent. Eisenhower explains the political reality. The press is howling for Patton's head. Congress is applying pressure. The War Department is furious. Eisenhower himself is receiving cables from Washington asking why Patton hasn't been relieved yet. And worse, Eisenhower knows that Patton's views aren't just a PR problem. They're a fundamental misreading of American policy and values. Patton stares at him, jaw clenched. Eisenhower lays out the options. Patton can make a public statement walking back his comments, apologizing, clarifying that he supports denazification policy without reservation. Or he can be relieved of command immediately and sent home in disgrace. It's not really a choice. Patton refuses to apologize. He argues that he was right, that history will vindicate him, that the Soviets are the real threat, that the Americans are making a strategic mistake. He's defiant, angry, convinced that he's being sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. Eisenhower's face hardens. "Then you leave me no choice," he says. On October 2, 1945, the announcement comes through official channels. General George S. Patton, Jr., has been relieved of command of the 15th Army. He will remain in Germany temporarily to complete administrative duties, but his active command is over, effective immediately. The warrior has been benched. Patton takes the news in stunned silence. For a man who defined himself by action, by combat, by leading men into battle, this is a kind of death. He's 60 years old. His war is over, and it ended not with glory but with a press conference. In his diary that night, Patton writes bitterly about politicians and journalists, about the ingratitude of a nation that forgets its warriors the moment the shooting stops. He rails against Eisenhower, against the policymakers, against the tide of history turning against him. But beneath the anger, there's something else. A recognition that he's become a relic, a man out of time. The relief sends shockwaves through the military. For many of Patton's former subordinates, men who fought under him from North Africa to Germany, the decision feels like a betrayal. They remember Patton not as a political liability but as the commander who led them to victory, who inspired them, who demanded everything and delivered results. To them, his relief is the triumph of bureaucrats over warriors. But for others, it's overdue. The slapping incidents in Sicily had revealed a cruel streak, a lack of empathy for soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD. His inflammatory statements about the Soviets had caused diplomatic headaches. And now this, defending Nazi party members while the world was still reeling from the revelations of the death camps. The debate rages in the press, in Congress, in living rooms across America. Was Patton right about the impracticality of denazification? Some historians would later argue yes, that the policy was applied too broadly, that it created administrative chaos, that former low-level party members were unfairly punished. Others would argue that any accommodation with Nazism, however pragmatic, was morally intolerable so soon after the Holocaust. But in 1945, the moral clarity is stark. Nazis are the enemy, period. Patton's nuance, his argument that not all party members were ideological zealots, sounds like apologia. His fixation on the Soviet threat, prescient as it may have been, sounds like deflection. And his defiance in the face of political reality sounds like arrogance. Eisenhower himself feels the weight of the decision. He's known Patton for 30 years. They were young officers together, survived the interwar years when the Army was a backwater, rose through the ranks together. Eisenhower admired Patton's audacity, his tactical brilliance, his ability to inspire men. But he also saw his flaws, the impulsiveness, the bigotry, the inability to operate in the political realm. In his memoirs, Eisenhower would write carefully about Patton, praising his battlefield accomplishments while acknowledging his limitations. But in private letters, he was more candid. Patton was a great battlefield commander and a poor diplomat, a man of immense talents and equally immense blind spots. The relief is final. Patton is given a ceremonial role, no troops, no real authority. He's effectively retired, though he doesn't use the word. And then 2 months later, on December 9, 1945, Patton is critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck is broken. He's paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, he's dead. The circumstances are tragic and abrupt, a mundane traffic accident ending the life of a man who survived countless battles. Conspiracy theories would swirl for decades, but the most likely explanation is the simplest. Bad luck, bad timing, a final stroke of fate for a man whose luck had run out. Patton's funeral is held on December 24, 1945, in Luxembourg. He's buried among the men of the Third Army in the American cemetery at Ham, thousands of white crosses stretching across the hillside. It's fitting, perhaps, that his final resting place is among his soldiers, the men who followed him into battle. Not in Arlington, not in some grand memorial, but here, in the soil of Europe. The eulogies are respectful, even glowing. They talk about his courage, his tactical genius, his role in the liberation of Europe. They gloss over the controversies, the relief, the bitterness of his final months. In death, Patton is already being transformed into legend, the hard-charging general with ivory-handled pistols, the man who believed in reincarnation and destiny, the warrior poet. But the questions linger. Could Patton have adapted to peacetime? Could he have learned to navigate the political realm with the same skill he showed on the battlefield? Or was he, as some argue, a man so defined by war that peace was intolerable to him? The relief this final controversy suggests the latter. Patton thrived in chaos, in the clarity of combat where objectives were clear and results were measurable. But in the murky world of occupation policy, of diplomacy, of managing public opinion, he was out of his depth. His refusal to apologize, his inability to see the political reality, his stubborn insistence that he was right All of it pointed to a man who couldn't or wouldn't change. Eisenhower, who went on to become president, would reflect on Patton in later years with a mixture of admiration and sadness. He recognized that Patton's relief was necessary, that keeping him in command would have been politically untenable and morally indefensible. But he also mourned the loss of a friend, a fellow soldier, a man whose talents were undeniable even as his flaws were fatal. The press conference in September 1945 was Patton's Rubicon. Not a river crossed with legions, but a microphone approached with recklessness. He spoke his mind, as he always had, but this time the consequences were immediate and irreversible. No battlefield heroics could save him. No tactical brilliance could undo the damage. In the end, Patton was a victim of his own honesty, or his own inability to see that some truths, even if partially valid, are politically radioactive. He believed he was speaking pragmatically about the challenges of occupation. What the world heard was a general defending Nazis. The gap between intention and perception destroyed him. And so we're left with a complicated legacy. A general who helped win the war in Europe but couldn't navigate the peace that followed. A man of extraordinary battlefield courage and equally extraordinary political tone-deafness. A warrior who believed he was destined for greatness but whose career ended not in glory, but in a press conference gone wrong. History has been kinder to Patton than his contemporaries were. We remember the drive across France, the relief of Bastogne, the victories that helped end the war. The controversies have faded, softened by time and the glow of nostalgia. But the lesson remains. Brilliance in one domain doesn't guarantee wisdom in another. And in the modern world, where cameras are always rolling and words travel instantly, even heroes can fall with a single careless sentence. Patton almost certainly never imagined that his career would end this way, not with a bang, but with a press conference. If you found this story as gripping as we did, do WWII Ember a favor, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. These forgotten moments of history deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. Drop a comment below. Do you think Patton was right about the Soviets, even if his timing was catastrophic? Or was his relief long overdue? We want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.